Jane Velez-Mitchell. We are thrilled to be live with some top environmentalists in the Los Angeles area. We're talking about this very controversial plan to bulldoze the Ballona Wetlands. And I'm going to play some clips from a recent Coastal Conservancy meeting where proponents were selling this bulldozing project, and people were literally pulling out their hair because we didn't get a chance to really respond in depth because public comment is very limited to a minute or two max. So we're going to play some clips and give folks here an opportunity to respond.
Some people are afraid that construction of the proposed project will hurt the wildlife that lives on the reserve. Fortunately, this is not the case. Many similar projects have been built without impacts to wildlife.
All right, Lisa Levinson, In Defense of Animals, take it away. Why does In Defense of Animals feel that is not accurate?
Well, we know that's not accurate because when you have a bulldozer, you need to move the animals to another location. And in this area, this is where they live. When you trap and transfer and move animals, also, you have to have a place to release them, and across the street is a parking lot, so there's no good place to release these animals. It's very important that they stay where they are. This area is thriving with wildlife, and that's what we're trying to show at In Defense of Animals. There are animals that will suffer. In fact, they'll be killed if they are no longer able to access this habitat. Some of them will be able to move or relocate themselves to slightly away from the bulldozing, but others will be killed.
So let me play something that actually illustrates their argument, and then we're going to have Walter Lamb, who is the president of the Ballona Wetlands Land Trust, respond. This is the proponents talking.
It's really hard for folks to get their head around why that would be destroyed, and I completely understand that. Mr. or Professor Strauss's comments really struck a note with me, that you see how vibrant some of the nature and the ecology is at the current location. Imagine what it would look like if this entire area were restored. My understanding from the staff recommendation as well as from the EIR is that the current wetlands and the salt pans will be left alone until other areas of the 600 acres are restored. A lot of comments about making these 1,700 species homeless. Will those areas that will be restored before the current wetlands and salt pans are impacted at all, will those areas provide suitable habitat for any of the or for the animals, the species that will be disrupted when the construction or when the restoration is done in the wetlands and in the salt pans?
Again, I'll answer quickly, and I'll defer to the director, but absolutely. And that's the intent of the phasing of the project.
Right.
And there's fairly extensive discussion of mitigation measures in the EIR to ensure that there are no impacts. And in fact, the entire point of the project is to expand habitat.
So board member, I'll add two additional facts. First, your question is exactly why the department amended its preferred alternative and brought greater emphasis to sequencing the actual doing of the project.
Right.
If you look at table 2-6 in the EIR, there's a possibility of 35 smaller stages from beginning to full completion.
So he's saying basically, don't worry about it. They're going to do it gradually, and they're just going to move the animals little by little. But is that how it works? Walter Lamb, can you take that? I mean, is that how animals live? Is that how owls and egrets and possums and skunks and all sorts of animals, 1,007 including endangered and threatened, move? Do they just move across the street like human beings when they get a new lease on an apartment?
So I think, as somebody mentioned earlier, you can't make a blanket statement like that for every species. Every species is very different in terms of the habitat they can use, in terms of their migration patterns. We have some species that forage here, some that breed here, some that are very sedentary, some that have what's called high site fidelity. So Belding Savannah sparrow, for example, the draft EIR specifically calls out that they have a high site fidelity, that they don't, as you said, just go across the street necessarily. But I think that the comments that you just played follow a pattern of just being overly simplistic. And that's not how we should be thinking about these restorations. These issues are complex. I think that the first point, that they're going to create new habitat north of the creek before they destroy any habitat south of the creek. I think two things. One, it misses the point that they do absolutely intend to destroy habitat south of the creek. That's well documented in the EIR, and I think it's legitimate for us to be concerned about that. It's also legitimate for us to be concerned with what they're going to do north of the creek, because the whole point of the project is to lower the elevation in one fell swoop and then knock down the levees. So while the director talked about 35 different construction sequences, those construction sequences cannot be discrete projects in and of themselves, right? If you just dug out the dirt and then didn't do the next phase or the next sequence, you just have a big excavated hole sitting there for a long time. And I think the point that somebody else made is, that is, I believe, a 185 acre area. It's a large area. And so when you completely excavate that area, you can't just move animals from that area to another area. It might not be the right habitat, but also you're creating a different density of population. So our organization isn't opposed to the idea of restoration. We think that there could be some instances where bulldozers are necessary to right a wrong, like removing the parking lots. That's something that we would see probably heavy construction. But our issue is really that they are taking a complex scientific issue and they're oversimplifying it into these, very marketing-driven sound bites. And as somebody who cares about the environment, somebody who goes down to the wetlands frequently to document what's there, as do many other people, I see firsthand that that's just not going to work the way they claim that it's going to work. That's really the concern. I think that's something that everyone should be concerned about, whether you like the idea of having more estuarine wetland or you like the idea of keeping what's there now, which is more of the seasonal freshwater wetland. We ought to be confident that what's being proposed will work as it's being sold to us, and it just won't. I just think engineering, they've already started to admit a lot of that.
Let's talk about the big aspect of this that has really dominated the headlines, and that is the fossil fuel industry. I'm going to play a clip of one of the many, many protests against this restoration, which critics, including all of us, call a phony restoration, and the involvement of the fossil fuel industry, because there is a gas storage facility underneath the wetlands, and it is very old. We all know that just over 5 years ago, a similar facility in Aliso Canyon blew out, becoming one of the worst environmental disasters in California history.
Jane, we're not hearing the sound, or at least I'm not.
Okay. All right, so that was just an example of one of the protests against the Ballona Wetlands. Let's go back to the Coastal Conservancy hearing and hear what they had to say about SoCal Gas. Then we're going to hear from Marcia Hanscom of the Sierra Club.
There are some interesting things that we need to resolve. Now, I think perhaps one of the most important ones is the notion that there are financial interests that are behind this entire program. We heard a number of different comments about SoCal Gas and about how this entire project is a boondoggle for SoCalGas. My reading of the EIR was somewhat different from that. And my understanding of what is happening with SoCalGas on this property is, number one, that SoCalGas has had easements and that they have had tanks buried beneath Ballona Wetlands since well before this land was purchased by the state many years ago, and that this plan and this restoration would have no impact on those easements. I also understand from the EIR that part of the program will be to dismantle and to reduce the number of natural gas tanks that are buried.
All around.
I beg your pardon? Okay, so my understanding of the EIR was to dismantle some of those. So my direct question, and so to me it appeared as though, at least from what I understand to be the case, that this project will not be enhancing the value of SoCalGas. And so I just want somebody perhaps at the staff to just comment briefly on SoCalGas. I mean, is this a boondoggle? Is this something where that this program is based, instead of on restoring this beautiful land, is it based instead on some interest in restoring or maintaining the value of SoCalGas?
Director Bonham, do you want to answer that, or would you like me to take the first cut? I'll just say quickly that the natural gas storage facility injects natural gas into former where oil was once pumped out. So it's sort of into the land, as I said, about a mile beneath the surface. So Southern California Gas owns easements that allow them to have surface monitoring wells and the roads to access those wells. And if they don't give up those easements, then the department would not be able to regrade and restore those areas that those surface easements are on top of. And so the EIR looked at the relocation of some of those facilities onto the Southern California Gas campus and slant drilling so they could still have their same operational function without having a footprint on the ecological reserve.
The operative word there, Marcia Hanscom, is that so SoCalGas could continue to have its operational function at a time when the LA City Council has urged that this aging gas storage facility be shut down. In essence, the way they're presenting it, correct me if I'm wrong, and I invite SoCalGas on and anybody involved in this, anybody who testified anytime, they're presenting it as SoCalGas is being so nice to move so that we can do a restoration, when indeed the LA City Council is saying this facility poses a danger, let's shut it down. And in order for them to continue operating, according to critics, they need an excuse to get down there and upgrade and remove and reposition their aging gas storage facility. Take it away, Marcia.
Yeah, well, what I noticed in listening to that is how they talk in circles around the real issue. The real issue is that SoCalGas has a storage facility. They pump in gas that was fracked in Oklahoma, Texas. They pipe it all the way in to the Los Angeles coast. I mean, that alone is a huge fossil fuel operation that shouldn't be happening. But then they store it beneath the surface so that entities can use it, and it's primarily commercial entities like Chevron, Torrance Refinery, and some of the Edison and some of the other utilities that still use fossil fuels to operate their power plants. And we need to get away from that. We need to be, yesterday, day before, the hottest days ever in Canada and Portland, Oregon. And, we are in a climate emergency. We need to stop right now. We really need to do everything we can to transition to renewable energy. And this facility will continue to operate underneath the Ballona Wetlands. It's not going anywhere. It's not really being moved. The only thing they're talking about moving in reality are some of the infrastructure pieces on top of the surface. In other words, there are some wells throughout the ecological reserve that they would remove and move. That's what it says, that they will move them to another site immediately adjacent to the ecological reserve, where there are wetlands too, by the way, on SoCalGas
Do they
property.
need to bulldoze to do that?
Well,
in other words,
yes.
There is a gentle restoration plan that has been proposed. You were instrumental in writing it. It's on defendballonawetlands.org. It achieves all the legitimate goals of restoration without the massive bulldozing over 10 years and more than $200 million. The only thing it does not achieve is allowing SoCalGas to dig up and move its aging, crumbling gas infrastructure. And again, we invite SoCalGas on any time. And we just saw that the LA City Council has voted to shut down the facility. So you could shut it down, right? But if it's moved to the point where it can continue operating through the process of this restoration, does that in essence allow the facility to continue? Yes or no, Marcia?
Yes, it does. It does. That's the whole point, is that this would allow them to stay there for decades into the future. And we don't have decades to deal with our climate emergency. So we really cannot be supporting such a project. The fact that the governor's appointees are supporting this when he says we are in a climate emergency, there's just something missing there in the translation.
Well, the other thing I want to ask about, and we're going to get to the flood risk in a second and the alleged rising sea levels, but Lisa Levinson of In Defense of Animals, you've been very, very active in this. They say they want to bulldoze the whole thing over the course of 10 years. We're talking about 600 plus acres, in order to help wildlife, when indeed there's 1,700 wildlife species living there right now, some endangered, some threatened. So the question is, you destroy their home in order to provide habitat for them. Does that make sense? Especially when you consider that the World Wildlife Fund has issued a report saying that animal populations are being decimated. They've declined 70% in 50 years, and there are predictions that in a decade we will have essentially no wildlife vertebrates left. So where are the animals that are supposed to exist in 10 years that are going to hypothetically replace the animals who will be dispossessed today?
Exactly. The issue is that the animals who do live there, such as the white-tailed kite, which is a protected species, for example, that species thrives in Area A, which is grasslands and meadows. When they destroy, according to their plan, destroy Area A, this white-tailed kite will have to go to another area, which is a salt pan, that is not the perfect habitat for this beautiful white-tailed kite. So we will lose these animals. Either they will die or they will move to other areas, and they've recently repopulated the area. And that's part of what's going on here, is that this area has been repopulated by many new species recently that have been seen in these areas that they plan to destroy. So we are against the destruction. We're in favor of the gentle restoration, which can be done while the animals are there and doesn't involve any bulldozing.
Thank you for that. Lisa Levinson of In Defense of Animals, and you are looking at images of species, photographs from the wetlands. These animals are there now, and it is being falsely described as this dead and dying area when the photographs were taken right on the Ballona Wetlands. These animals exist there right now. So let's go to some other issues, because this is a very complicated subject. And if you're listening to the officials talk and say, I don't understand what they're saying, join the club. A lot of what they say is expressed in ways that is really hard to understand. But here's a very basic comment. I'm going to play this and then get Walter Lamb's response.
As gorgeous as it is now, will we and do we have an opportunity to do something that will have lasting benefit for many, many generations to come? Or will we allow it to be overcome by sea level rise?
So there you go. Walter, sea level rise. He's claiming that if we do nothing, the sea will rise and destroy the wetlands. You are the president of the Ballona Wetlands Land Trust. What say you, sir?
So I think the first thing I would say is our organization absolutely believes that the sea levels are rising, and that is an important thing that we need to take into account. I think the first thing I would point out is that the choice is not between doing the proposed project and doing nothing. That's a false choice. The proposed project is very small. I don't think that was part of the clip that you played, but the proposed project they are now admitting would convert most of the coastal marsh into what's something called mudflat. Mudflat is also important habitat, but it would be like saying that you could replace your heart with a third lung, right? Lungs are important, but they don't do the function that a heart does. You couldn't survive with 3 lungs and no heart. And likewise, the Ballona wetlands without coastal marsh would really cease to be the Ballona wetlands as we know them. So that's an unacceptable outcome, and they're starting to admit that, and they're starting to admit that they need to do further mitigation. So that's the first point I would make. Secondly, though, even within the EIR, that does not support this gloom and doom prophecy that you'd have to shut down the gates and any time in the near term, and that those gates would then, or that the wetlands would become stagnant ponds. That is just absolutely false. It's not supported in their EIR. It's sort of a scare tactic that they've developed post EIR. What the EIR specifically says is that sometime between 2070 and 2100, 50 to 80 years from now, they might have to shut down the gates. They don't really explain why. They don't analyze any alternatives. They don't analyze any kind of pumping mechanism. And they only are now starting to acknowledge what we raised in our response, that they could use sediment to try to keep pace with sea level rise. But that's likely something that would work much better with the existing levee system, not with their new proposed levee system. So this is a high stakes question for this project, and they've done a really bad job of responding to it. And I'll give it back to you. At some point, we could tie that in to some of the other things we've been talking about, like habitat for endangered species.
So, Marcia, we were watching, the reason we're playing these clips is that you even heard one person go, "No, it won't," trying to get our side into these hearings that seem almost preordained, even though they say, "Thank you so much for the comments." It seems like they're on a track to get this done, come hell or high water. Where does it stand right now? We know that there are 6 lawsuits. This is just one of them against this plan to bulldoze the Ballona wetlands over the course of approximately a decade. And where are we?
Well, this proposed project has been being worked on by some outside interests, some private interests, and a few bureaucrats who really want to see this project happen for about 14 years. So some would say, well, it'll never happen. But here's the thing, they're getting closer. It's like a slow train going down the wrong track. And the wrong track is the problem, because eventually it could be devastation for the Ballona wetlands. And so they just got this $2 million approved by the Coastal Conservancy. That's what this hearing was about. And that will allow them to fix some of the problems that they already created in their engineering plans. They've spent nearly $15 million on just planning this project. That should tell you there's a problem right there. And so, but they have no federal permits. And the reason is the federal government, the Army Corps of Engineers, is looking askance at this project. They're saying, wait a minute, you didn't even use the right flood risk standards. So you're going to have to start over, which is kind of what they're doing with this extra $2 million. But they're going to try and keep going faster, and they're using this approval to try and get other agencies to want to climb on board. But this is just not the project that anyone should be supporting.
Now, they have also, this is indigenous land, and there are burial grounds, indigenous burial grounds. There are complaints by indigenous leaders who spoke at this conservancy hearing, the State Coastal Conservancy hearing. Let's play that clip and we'll get some reaction on the other side.
My name is Gabrielle Crow. I'm an environmental educator as well as a tribal council member for the Gabrielino Shoshone tribal group. Many of you may know my grandmother. Her name was Vera Rocha. She was the one who fought for many years to prevent the development of this land. The wetlands are a sacred site to the Tongva people, and any construction or restoration can damage the already fragile ecosystem that's there, that's home for many different species of plants and animals. And as far as I know, maybe as far as the last person that commented, some tribal descendants have been notified, but not many. I know that the people from my tribe, as well as Anthony Morales from another band of the Gabrielino tribe, has not been notified or has not been aware of this project. And I'm asking you to actually consult those people and actually, instead of just saying that that's going to happen, that it actually happens. And I'm asking you to consider my ancestors as well as my future descendants before you move further in this project. Thank you. My name is Gabrielle.
Okay, so Lisa Levinson, your response, because part of the money that they got approved was to go to the community and basically sell this to people, and they are kind of, according to critics, hiding behind the notion of more public access when IDA and others have been trying to say, open the gates now. There are walking trails, there are benches, there are bike racks, there's a gate that keeps it all locked.
Yes, exactly. So this area has had limited access for decades, really. And some school groups have been able to go through. And what we're asking is to open the gates so that you can do a lot more public education on what is now available. There are trails there. They even paid to have a lovely fence put up. It's a gate with animals on it, and it's really inviting, and then people are not invited in from the public, only very limited groups under specific supervision. So what we'd like to do is see people in the neighborhood and adjoining areas have access to this and have interpretive information there. It could be a wonderful place where people learn about the local animals and why we want to protect them.
And again, those were some of the suggestions made in the gentle restoration plan. Nobody's saying that it doesn't need any restoration. The question is, what kind of restoration, and what happens to the 1,700 species that are there now as we are in the midst of the 6th mass extinction? So, Marcia, they claim that they have listened to people and that's why they're doing it gradually. Do you buy any of that?
No, I don't, because I watched what some of these same people did at Malibu Lagoon, and I mean, you should see it today. It's a disaster area. What they have, these are people who don't understand this system. They don't understand that this is a mosaic of different kinds of habitats, and different species need different things. What I can't figure out is why the Department of Fish and Wildlife is buying into this, because they have experts on their staff who obviously have not looked at this project. The people at the top are keeping this away from the real experts. The experts about ecological restoration have said this is not a restoration. And that's why the LA County Democratic Party even came out against this. They listened to the experts on both sides and said, this isn't right. Something's wrong. This is a construction project. This is a 9-year construction project. They intend to remove everything and start over. If they try and do it in little pieces, first of all, that's against the law. That's called piecemealing. You cannot do it in little pieces.
But they said that. Wait, they said that publicly. We all heard Chuck Bonham say that they're going to do it in tiny little pieces on the pretext that that is going to make it easier for the animals, which those on the panel who are experts say that's not how it works. And we're going to try to bring in one other biologist who's just joined us to comment on that further. So there are 6 lawsuits right now against this Ballona Wetlands so-called restoration that people say actually is just a wholesale destruction over the course of a decade. How are you going to challenge that piecemeal, which they have said publicly now that's what they're going to do? You're saying that that's not. Walter, would you like to weigh in?
Yeah, we're one of the organizations that filed the lawsuit, and I just want to clarify that because I know piecemealing is not allowed. There's nothing that would stop an agency from doing a project, actually implementing the project in phases. What you're not allowed to do is do one SEQA analysis for part of it, start that part of the project when you know that there's another phase that has to happen later. That's what's not allowed. I think the real issue with what we all heard Chuck Bonham say is that there are going to be environmental impacts to sequencing. If you take a big project that's meant to be done sort of in 2 phases, which is how they articulated it, and then you say it's actually going to be 35 phases, and they even said we might even halt the project at some point. That has inherent ripple effects, right? Impacts on the environment that we need to be able to analyze. So that's, I think, where they're going to fall into trouble. And I'll just say that when we're talking about litigation, we're actively exploring a possible challenge to these funds that we've just talked about, the $2 million in funds. And the idea is, Marcia used the analogy of a train going down the tracks. And what SEQA was meant to do is prevent the train from actually leaving the station until all of the analysis is done. All of the analysis gets done. The decision makers look at that analysis and they come up with the preferred destination, if you will. What's happened here is they're admitting that analysis was bad. But now they're saying, okay, but we certified it anyways. Train is leaving the station. We're going to put $2 million more into going down those tracks. And they're no longer considering any of the other destinations, even though the one that they chose was chosen based on what they're now admitting is faulty information. And just one last part of that train analogy is that it's not only that we're now going down the wrong path, it's that all the money and time that's being spent going down that wrong path is time and money that's not being spent going down a positive path for the Ballona Wetlands. That's why we're 17, 18 years after the acquisition of this land, and the Department of Wildlife, which owns it, Fish and Wildlife, which owns it, is calling it degraded. And that's not where we should be, right? And so as a community, that's where I think we can all come together and say, we've got to put this train on the right track. It's a positive step that we want to take, not a negative step.
Let's see if we can bring in Robert Vanderhoek. Can you hear us, Robert?
Yes, I can.
Okay, so here's the thing that I don't understand. One of their big justifications is that the area has a lot of non-native habitat in terms of growth of plants. Why do you need to bulldoze it to provide native flora and fauna? In the gentle restoration plan that I know you were involved in, there's a way to bring in a native flora and fauna without bulldozing. I mean, it makes kind of sense. You just take some of the grasslands or whatever that are not what they would consider native and you replace it with something that is, and do it in a gentle way without displacing the animals. Take it away, Robert.
Sure. Well, there are 2 ways that native wildlife.
Sorry. Go ahead.
There are 2 ways that native wildlife can be at Ballona and come back. One is on their own, which everyone knows happens when you let a landscape be alone and rest, and you discontinue a contamination or some kind of pollution, that the habitat starts to recover. So the coyote came back in 2008. And that's one example. And the least-belled vireo, a federally endangered species, came back in the last 5 years. The great blue heron that you see there after relentless hunting came back on their own after hunting was terminated in our region, and trees grew up to height so that they can nest in trees. The gray fox has come back. The red-winged blackbird that you see there is in non-native fennel and mustard plants. It doesn't have to be a native plant to support native wildlife. And in fact, the California Department of Fish and Wildlife, who owns and manages, and it's the fox guarding the hen house here, they have identified non-native annual grassland as a very important habitat, more important than wetlands in California, and that all kinds of native wildlife is associated with it. So when we say non-natives, that they're mischaracterizing it, because everywhere that you look, there's native plants mixed together with non-native plants. And this is virtually the way all of our ecosystems are in North America and around the world now, is where we have a mix of native plants and non-native plants, and they are cooperating and in balance. And many hundreds of scientists now have come on board to say ecologists got it wrong in saying plants are invasive or species are invasive. It's all being restructured in our thinking now, that there's an equilibrium and an ecology that's blending native and non-native species together. It's better to refer to a lot of our non-natives as new natives or naturalized species. And and I see Lisa smiling, another biologist here who's getting that. And
yes, and let me go back to Lisa for a second and just ask you about what IDA is doing, because I know In Defense of Animals has taken a huge lead on this story. What are you doing to get the governor, who has talked about nature-based solutions, to see that this is not a nature-based solution if it's going to displace 1,700 species? And I'd like to say personally that they point to previous restorations and say, look, the animals came back. Well, I pass the Oxford Lagoon on a daily basis that they restored. No biodiversity. All you see are seagulls. Now, that's like saying there's biodiversity in Manhattan because there's pigeons. No, that's not biodiversity. That's just seagulls. The other animals are gone. And so that, from my own eyesight, I would testify in a court of law that these quote unquote restorations, the animals don't magically reappear and re-inhabit the spaces that have been dug up. Lisa Levinson.
Yes, exactly. Well, we were involved at that Oxford Lagoon. I actually protested there on my birthday many years ago to stop that, because we knew that the animals may not repopulate the same area, because it's as if all of the habitat is gone, so they have to find somewhere else. All of the plants that they depend on, either for food or for safe coverage, they're gone, so they can't live there anymore. And this is very serious. So, for example, they're planning to take out, in part of this plan, they'd like to take out the levees. And this endangered least Bell's vireo that Robert mentioned has been sighted on trees that are on these levees. And when they take out the trees, those birds will no longer have the habitat that they depend on for sustenance, and then they won't be there any longer. That's the issue, is when the plants and the animals are gone due to this construction, there won't be any habitat for them to survive on.
Walter, you wanted to make a point?
Yeah, I just want to, because I think, again, these topics are complex. And I think even on a call like this, it's good because we can have, we can discuss the nuance. And so we probably each would have a slightly different way of how we word things. Our organization generally would prefer native habitat to non-native habitat, but the points that have been made, we have to look at species by species. We have to be willing to take the time and energy to look at each species on a case-by-case basis. Now, the least Bell's vireo does also nest over by what's called the freshwater marsh. And so a lot of the project proponents have actually ignored the sightings that made by Jonathan Kaufman and others on laurel sumac trees and other trees, not necessarily on the levees, but adjacent to the levees, and that absolutely would be destroyed. So it's absolutely true to say that some least Bell's vireo breeding habitat will be eliminated by the project. There would.
I would like to just jump in and get a comment from Robert on that, because if you have a threatened or endangered species, my understanding is you can't destroy the habitat of a threatened or endangered species, that is protected under law. I don't know what law, I don't know if it's federal or state, but I think that's a general assumption in the public. Oh, you can't mess with endangered species. But what we're hearing here is that there is an endangered or threatened species, at-risk species, on the Ballona wetlands right now, and their habitat would be messed with if this project to bulldoze it goes forward.
Yes, and I think that the United States Fish and Wildlife Service, as opposed to the California Department of Fish and Wildlife, recognizes that with the least Bell's Vireo. And that's yet another reason why the federal government hasn't given a green light to this project. And the second part of this is that what we call recovery as opposed to restoration. And that's where you translocate or bring an animal back. Some of our animals, like the California quail, roadrunner, are virtually flightless. So they're never going to make it back to Ballona unless we bring them there and release male and females and start the nesting process again. And it's just one example. We can help endangered species with recovery plans and a recovery team, a recovery captain, and there is one for that least Bell's Vireo. And right now they're in conversation and expanding that rare songbird, neotropical migrant songbird that's been nesting at Ballona. And I'm looking at sandpipers and shorebirds now too that are getting help, and the short-eared owl that's there. We can have the short-eared owl nesting again at Ballona if we do a recovery plan for that sensitive species. So that's the goal. It's not that restoration's needed, is that we need to allow, do recovery plans and for our listed species. And we've got the state of California in a pickle now. They're kind of caught in a trap because they finished the EIR. They haven't addressed the least Bell's Vireo, and other federally endangered species are going to return too. Walter Lamb just documented a federal and state endangered yellow-billed cuckoo individual in the reserve, and it's there because we have willow habitat and cottonwood habitat on the edge of the sand dunes. And I've been now in consultation with a wildlife biologist that wants to help with doing a recovery program and getting the yellow-billed cuckoo, which has been showing up all around urban Southern California now. Thank you.
Yeah, and I mean, there's, my understanding, 6 lawsuits, this is just one of them, regarding this process. Do any of these lawsuits, to your knowledge, Marcia, address the fact that endangered species could, according to what we've discussed here, be wiped out by this, or threatened species, at-risk species, be wiped out? And anybody else can comment on this too. Sorry, there you go. Go ahead.
Unfortunately, a number of years ago, the state of California severely weakened its own endangered species law. That said, there are agencies like the California Coastal Commission who act as if we still had a strong state endangered species law, but our federal endangered species law is still pretty strong. And I think Robert was right in suggesting that that may be part of why the federal government is not ready to get on board here. The more endangered species showing up, the more we are going to have the proper consultation on this. And that's what the Army Corps of Engineers has to do with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. And if they don't, then there will be a federal lawsuit on that, I'm sure.
Lisa Levinson, we'll get to you, Robert. Lisa Levinson, you represent In Defense of Animals, so take it away on this issue.
Yeah, we're very concerned about the endangered species that have been documented at Ballona, and that's why we do want to call the government to task and bring them in. We have put together petitions where we have reached out to the Army Corps of Engineers to let them know that this is going on and that our supporters are against it.
Walter, you had a point to make.
Yes, and I'll just start as a bird watcher. I just need to be very precise in the observations. I did see a yellow-billed cuckoo just outside of the ecological reserve in the neighborhood of Playa del Rey. And then I did see it fly into, unless it took a hard right turn, it would have gone at least over the ecological reserve. But I just want to make sure I did not see it inside directly. But the other comments about the cottonwood trees and willows are absolutely relevant for that bird. But I want to say we absolutely sued Belding Center Sparrow and least Bell's Vireo are both referenced specifically in our lawsuit. The Belding Center Sparrow this project would be devastating. And I'm not saying that to try to sort of, generate any kind of anxiety or fear. It's just right in scientifically, it's right in the EIR. You can look at the habitat maps, and they're admitting this now, that it would convert existing Belding Savannah sparrow habitat into non-Belding Savannah sparrow habitat because of the sea level rise. You can't do that's not no one would spend $182 million on a restoration project for an ecological reserve where what's arguably the marquee species would get extirpated. It's just truly insane. But I think we need to be very precise in how we talk about these things and let the public know what's going on by referring to the EIR so that they can see that it's not us, just trying, having active imaginations, that this is the science that the state is admitting to. But I'll close on this point. In a separate presentation that was a UCLA symposium, one of the professors there who served in the science advisory committee early on for this project admitted that this was not a species-based restoration plan. They didn't go in and look at specific species. They purposely didn't do that because they wanted to take what they were calling a holistic look, which I can understand. But the problem with that is now you have all these species who clearly have fallen through the cracks, and there's a lack of analysis. Everything what you're hearing, I think, across all the speakers is that the analysis that was done was just incomplete, superficial. And I think that's what we're all sort of agreeing that needs to be fixed, and the law requires it to be fixed.
Well, I want to ask
Jane, may I add
yes,
something
go
to
ahead.
that? So Walter's exactly right, and he's a knowledgeable bird watcher, and I'm a avian ecologist, wildlife biologist that studies birds for my lifetime. And the bird that he brought up, the Belding Savannah sparrow, has tripled in nesting pairs in the last 10 years. And it could be connected to the coyote coming back on their own, because the coyote has brought a balance back to the ecology, because it's sort of regulating how many skunks and possums and raccoons are there and changing their behavior. And those other three mammals, the possum, raccoon, skunk, eat bird eggs and prey on young chicks in the nest. So that's part of what's needed by more study. Now, while this is all going on, the Department of Fish and Wildlife that manages Ballona, they're in consideration for petitions to put more species on the list, like a bumblebee and other bumblebee species are in consideration. And Jonathan Coffin, our photographer naturalist, documented that bumblebee on a non-native plant, ice plant, which they had wanted to remove. And this is causing real troubles because again, as I brought up earlier, we're seeing the cooperation and the mutualism that's occurring in a positive way, in a symbiosis with non-native species and native species. And we need to accept that. And
I'd like to just jump in and say, one of the reasons we're having this discussion again, we played some clips from the California State Coastal Conservancy meeting where we all tried to get these facts and these issues in, but when you're given a minute or two maximum to speak, it's very hard to make those points.
That was really upsetting.
Meanwhile, those who are promoting this will go on for the meeting itself went on hours, and they have a lot of time to present their side. So we are presenting our side because, in truth, the people who are promoting this are paid to promote it. Nobody here is making a living out of this. This is not something where we're doing this to profit. We are doing it because we are concerned. And I'm concerned. I live near the Ballona Wetlands and I see the animals every day. In fact, I am going to effort to play some videotape of some animals that I saw at the mouth of the Ballona Wetlands. I don't know if we're going to be able to see or hear any of them, but let's just look at them for a second. Let's look at these animals.
Group of 10 brown pelicans, now another 6 pelicans. Adult pelicans. They nest on the Channel Islands National Park and come to us at Ballona for 6 months of the year after nesting.
I don't know if you can hear me, but I counted more than 35 pelicans having the time of their lives. And this is right at the mouth of the Ballona Wetlands. I
Can you-
burst into tears. I burst into tears because I know that these animals have no clue that these powerful forces are going to, if they get their way, destroy their home. And I see this on a daily basis. These are just some of the animals that I personally have seen that I could testify in a court of law that exist there. So I will put that full screen, let you see it for a few seconds, and then we will stop this video, but you get the idea. Wow, there are a lot of animals there. A lot of animals there. So as we wrap up, final thoughts on what we can do to speak truth to power and to reason with people that this is not the way. Lisa Levinson, in defense of animals.
Yeah, so we actually arranged some meetings with some of the legislators and key decision makers. And that was one of the things that we were doing behind the scenes to inform them correctly about some of these issues going on at Ballona Wetlands. And we will continue to do that. And also, we really urge our supporters and people who are concerned to sign the petitions, because your voice matters too, for you to let them know that you care and that you don't want Ballona to be bulldozed and destroyed.
Yes, defendballonawetlands.org is the website. You can go to defendballonawetlands.org. It's right there at the bottom of your screen. Final thoughts, Walter Lamb.
Yeah, so we're litigating. We feel like when you have an impossible time having fact-based discussions with an agency, the best thing to do is to bring it into a different forum. Courts of law, the famous quote from Amy Berman Jackson, courts are a place that facts still matter. We get to present our evidence. The judge looks at that evidence, and we have a fact-based conversation. So I think supporting the litigation is important, and that's where we are right now.
Thank you. And briefly, if we could have Robert, you are a biologist. You've documented the animals there. Where are we? You're also one of the plaintiffs in this lawsuit.
Yeah, I feel very, very good that I've joined into the Defend Ballona Wetlands lawsuit against the state of California as a scientist and an individual, and alongside some other citizens that are as plaintiffs also. And I feel very good that ours is one of 4 lawsuits that's involved in this, and that's really important. And I'm so glad you brought out the brown pelican, because it really tells us so much. That's an estuary. That water's 8 feet deep. And those pelicans are there because there's fish, native fish swimming underneath, and that's their prey item. And they like to go to these brackish waters where the water's blended, so that parasites and that like to land on, try to live on their throat and in their beak and their pouch and on their feathers and their skin are eliminated when they can go to the fresh water and rest and be in that water also.
Thank you, Robert. Yes, animals are currently depending on it. This is why when they say, oh, it's dead and dying, those of us who see the animals want to pull out our hair. I see them. I see them all the time. It's not dead and dying. They've tried to make it look from the perimeter like it's dead and dying. I think they've let it get run down. And that can be gently restored. Marcia, I'm going to give you the last word. Marcia Hanscom of the Ballona Institute.
Yeah, and I'm also a Sierra Club leader, and I want to say that we are looking for other organizations, whether it's a church organization, a Little League group, an environmental group, or a Boys and Girls Club. Anyone who thinks this project is wrong, please join us. You can send an email to Sierra Club Ballona Wetlands at gmail.com. And or you can, like Jane said, go to defendballonawetlands.org, this community-based group of all of the organizations that have concerns about this project, and let us know that you are also opposed, and let your elected officials know. Anyone who, if you have a relationship with any elected official, let them know this about how bad this project is, because there are so many agencies and so many jurisdictions involved that it is likely that your elected official, whether it's a county supervisor or a Congress member or a US senator or a state senator, they all have some way of weighing in on this, and we need their voices. We need them to represent our voices.
Yes, and these animals cannot speak for themselves in a court of law. They cannot speak for themselves at a Coastal Conservancy hearing or any of the other hearings that have been held. So we urge you to sign up at defendballonawetlands.org. The URL is right there at the bottom of your screen. Defendballonawetlands.org. Here it comes. You can just put your email in and you will be getting notifications about hearings where you can speak truth to power, even if it's only for a minute or two, but you can do your best to tell them that, you know, we're all in favor of making it better, but destruction is not restoration. Wholesale destruction is not restoration. And I'll just end with the idea that, you know, when I went to Buckingham Palace as a tourist years ago, I looked around, I go, you know, it could use a little restoration. Well, what if somebody said, yeah, we're gonna just tear down Buckingham Palace, we're gonna dig with bulldozers, dig it all up. That's my restoration plan. I'd say you're out of your mind. Well, it's the same situation here. You don't need to destroy the whole thing in order to restore it. So check out the Gentle Restoration Plan, which is at defendballonawetlands.org, and get involved because we are running out of time. We are literally in a sixth mass extinction as we speak. By the time this project is finished, we may have no more animals, wildlife, vertebrates left to repopulate. And the final thing I want to say is that on the subject of public access, public access could be provided right now. And those who are in favor of this have strongly opposed it, saying they wouldn't allow public access unless there were bathrooms and all sorts of things, citing it's dangerous now. Well, who made it dangerous? If the California Department of Fish and Wildlife is supposed to be looking at it, shouldn't they ensure the safety? Shouldn't they make sure that people aren't just camping out there and setting up tents? So they've let it go. So the second thing I want to say is that with the advancement of transportation as a service, I read a study which was absolutely fascinating, saying that because most cars are in parking lots or in their garages literally something like 90% of the time, when transportation as a service becomes ubiquitous, which it is in the process, they've already got autonomous vehicles in Nevada and other places. When they take over, the need for parking lots is going to almost completely vanish because people won't need to park their cars. They're going to be using transportation. An autonomous vehicle will pick you up and take you to point A and then bring you back. This is the future. And they said that in Los Angeles alone, there will be space available for green space that is the equivalent of 2 small cities in Los Angeles alone. In other words, all those parking lots that you see, these ginormous parking lots everywhere, can be turned into green space. One of the reasons why I think they got rid of their plan for a parking lot in this controversial plan is because they know that. They're still proceeding as if there is nowhere else for the public to go. And they're doing it while prohibiting public access to the wetlands. You know, the kids, the inner city kids that they purport to be standing up for don't need just more grass. What they could really use is mindful access to actual nature, where they could see these species, where they could learn about the species, where they could learn about the indigenous tribes, where there could be tours that educate them about what is there, the animals that are there. Not just another Disney-fied park. So with all that being said, that's my 2 cents. Thank you so much, incredible panel, for joining us today. And please get involved. Visit defendballonawetlands.org. Sign up. We need everybody to speak for the wildlife and wild habitats. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.